South Africa has one of the worst performing education systems in the world. Well, that's according to a series of reports released today by a leading development think tank, the Center for Development Enterprise, CDE. Speaking at a function where the reports were released to the public, CDE Executive Director Bernstein said the time has come for society, business, all political parties, parents and the public to up the pressure on government and push for system-wide reforms that significantly improve the quality of teaching in the classroom. And Bernstein joins us on the line to take us through these reports. Good evening, and thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me, Vuyo. Great to be here.
Perhaps before we can get to aspects of the reports themselves, the reason why you felt this was an important issue to highlight and do that in the manner that you did, because we have an unemployment crisis, we have an electricity crisis, we have all manner of crises, and we're not doing much, if anything, to actually resolve them. And by and large, the experience has been that we don't even diagnose the problems correctly, and that perhaps explains why we are failing or finding it difficult to resolve these crises.
That's a good question, Vuyo, and let me start with, there are many people who might say, why is CDE adding yet another priority to a growing list of national priorities? And clearly there are other issues: power, generation, crime, jobs and growth, as you pointed out, not to mention our ports and rail. We're very well aware of that, and we have also called for prioritization by the country and the president for action. But you have to ask yourself this question: are you prepared to condemn millions of South African learners to yet another round of terrible education? So that's the question that motivated us. We've done a lot of work on various other issues, and we're not naive in thinking that this government is going to act. I believed the president when in 2017 he launched his campaign to be the ANC president, when he said he wanted to reform education, he wanted to improve our schooling system. And so we started thinking about that project as long ago as that. It was delayed during COVID, but we now think it's really important that in the lead up to the general election next year, and then hopefully a new government, that we make this one of the top priorities for the country. There is no focus on the importance of basic schooling and making this far, far better than it is today. And so we're trying to mobilize everybody to shout out about the changes that have to be made to improve South Africa's basic schooling.
Is it for lack of trying on the part of those in charge, or those who are tasked with dealing with these issues?
Look, we've had a minister since 2009, and in the very low bar of our cabinets, she has been one of the better performers. And it's very unusual for CDE to call for a new minister, which is what we're doing. A new minister, a new DG, a top team in both the national department and in many of the provinces. But we're doing this for the following reasons. The minister has tried to introduce important reforms. She introduced a unit in her department to investigate what was going on in basic schooling around the country, NEDU, but then that was reduced to almost a meaningless unit because of the pressures against the findings that it had in its first major report and its independence. She tried to introduce performance management into this vast system But after years of negotiation, she retreated because of pressures from the unions, particularly SATU. And the same with the national assessments. She tried to introduce this, they did do it, and then it was withdrawn because of opposition from SATU. But the most important reason we are calling for this is because the minister has failed to deal with cadre deployment and corruption throughout the education bureaucracy. She had the courage to appoint an impressive task team in 2014 to deal with allegations in the newspapers about the selling of principal positions in Natal and elsewhere. She did set up this committee, the task team. They reported in 2016, and their report was damning. But she has not implemented any one of the corruption-related recommendations from that task team to this day. So those are some of the reasons why we're saying we need a very different, energetic new team at the top of basic education. They need to be committed to reform. They need to be ready to deal with the tough issues, and they need some public targets that they set themselves. We have to move off the bottom of almost every single international test that our learners do. We have to move up, and we have to make sure that the nearly 80% of our kids in grade 4 who cannot read for meaning, that this terrible situation starts to change as quickly as possible.
Now let's get into which you just started doing. Let's get into some aspects of these reports, starting with which is an issue that Report 1 speaks to in part, and that is the fact that we are, as a country and as a percentage of the GDP, spending on education. The education allocation is the biggest item. But of course, over the years, people have been saying that we're not getting bang for our buck. For the 2023-2024 year, we're talking about 309 billion rands that we spend on education.
It's about 13% of the national budget. I'm not sure it's the largest item, but it's very large indeed. And we don't think the amount of money that we spend is the issue. The question is, what are we getting for it? And I think there are three reasons why we're struggling to perform as a system. The one is our teachers are struggling. Professor Nick Spall has said that 4 out of 5 South African teachers are not equipped, both in terms of subject content and teaching skills, pedagogical skills, to teach effectively, whether it's in maths or in reading. That's a very damning conclusion about the state of our teachers. We don't train them well at our universities. We don't select them well. And although it's started to improve with some new teachers coming through that are better, we're arguing that the teachers are struggling, and the minister herself has said a few years ago that we have the highest absentee rate of all the SADC countries. So that's pretty damning. That's the first issue on how we're spending our money. The second is, as I've said, we have the leading trade union, the dominant trade union, has a policy of cadre deployment into the schooling system. That is coupled with enormous corruption in the schooling system. I'll just give you one story. I happened to see a newspaper article about a Soweto school, and the treasurer of the school governing body said something like the following. He said, "The education department are gangsters, and they are looting everything to do with our school and the budget we should be getting. We're appealing for help from law enforcement and from the SIU. This is not just one isolated example. Corruption Watch found a lot of reports of corruption in education last year. And as I've said, the 2016 report was damning in its findings on corruption, none of which were followed through, no criminal prosecutions on the 38 cases that they highlighted. And they said at the time that SATU is in charge of the management, administration, and priorities of at least 6, probably more, provincial education departments. This affects the quality of the bureaucracy. It affects the quality of our principals and teachers. So if you're a good teacher, you can imagine what it feels like to know somebody bought their position and they're not really up to the job. You can imagine what it feels like if you're a good teacher who comes every day and works hard, and the person getting the same salary as you doesn't pitch up on Mondays or Fridays and really doesn't work hard at all. So all of this seeps through to a system that is not performing.
Now, you highlight, or the report highlights, countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Albania, who are developing countries, but when you compared South Africa against, these countries, you found that, they spend far less per capita on education than we do. What are the things that these countries are doing, whether it's about how they train their teachers or how the system is managed, and how stakeholder management, and I'm raising this on the back of what you just said about SATU.
Well, Vuyo, that finding comes not from work we did, but from an Oxford and Harvard professor, Lance Pritchard, probably the leading scholar analyzing education systems and reform across the world. And he looked at World Bank data, and that was his conclusion, that South Africa was the biggest underperformer compared to all those other countries, many of which are poorer than us, for per capita income. So that was his conclusion and his work across very many countries. We didn't have the resources to look at all those different countries. We did look at one country and the research on Peru, which is one of Latin America's star performers. And we looked at Latin America because we were looking for countries with high inequality and with strong trade unions, and not ideal histories like South Africa's, a lot of poverty and problems in the communities where schools are located. And Peru is interesting because they came last in one of the major international tests in 2012. And the new Minister of Education immediately owned the problem. He said, we're in deep trouble and we're going to do something about this. And they did start testing teachers and a number of other sort of activities that we are advocating, and those delivered results. By 2018, they had jumped over 12 other countries to move off the bottom of that international table to deliver. So testing teachers and principals was very important, and monitoring developments very closely to see how your reforms were working and what you could be adjusting as you went along, and not just waiting until the matric exam.
Now, among the other issues, of course, the report's raising is poor accountability, which you've been speaking to, but also a corruption, which is you have spoken to, but also the issue of cadre deployment and too many incompetent staff members is how the report puts it. Is it a lack of will, is there a lack of will to tackle this issue? And I've seen how the debate has kind of started changing. You know, people from the governing party saying, well, this is only raised with regard to, you know, the national government and provinces run by the ANC. No one says anything about the Western Cape and how rife cadre deployment is there, which to me is really, you know, playing around with, we shouldn't even be talking about that. We should be talking about how to tackle the problem that the president has actually, spoke about at length at the state capture inquiry, because he presided over that deployment, you know, structure of the governing party. So we should focus on what matters, which is what to do with the issue of cadre deployment, which has proven to be a big problem.
I couldn't agree more with that. Look, the Chief Justice of the country in the Zondo report last year said that cadre deployment was effectively unlawful and unconstitutional. Now, this is a formal policy of SATU, and at the time of the ministerial task team in 2016, they discovered that all the Deputy Directors General in Education were active members of SATU attending union meetings. Now, you have to ask yourself, can a union run the country's education department? And our answer is no. We are certainly in favor of unions, and teachers have every right to form their own unions, and there are a number of them. Managers in our bureaucracy have a right to form their own union if they want to, but they can't be in the same union. You can't be a manager and a member of SATU. This is just not good practice. And so we're saying what you have to do now, we're saying there are 5 things that the country should focus on very briefly. Firstly, we have to recognize and then tackle cadre deployment and corruption in the education bureaucracy. What government must do is take a strong stand against this in education, and they have to work with SATU to say cadre deployment into the education bureaucracy is not on. We need to protect whistleblowers. All the things we're saying nationally, Vuyo, we need to say about education. And the department needs to lead on this. We need to protect whistleblowers. We need criminal prosecutions. We need to root out corruption. And we need to stop cadre deployment. We need a system that is built on merit. And people need to apply for positions and know that they will get a fair interview, that bribery is not involved, and the best candidate will be appointed. So that's absolutely vital, that we move the system as fast as possible away from the terrible things that are being reported to be happening and that the ministerial task team discovered. So, for example, one of the recommendations from the task team in 2016 was to renegotiate SATU's special right to sit in on recruitment negotiations and hearings. So there's a lot to be done, and the task team spelt it all out for the department. That's one critical thing we've got to do to move away from what is a really extremely worrying situation that affects the competence of the bureaucracy and teachers and principals and our ability to deliver the quality learning in our classrooms that we desperately need.
Is there anything that you found, was there anything that you found to be working, or at least something to build upon?
Look, there's certainly innovations in the last 12, 14 years that have been positive. If you remember, quite a long time ago, there was a lot of talk about introducing workbooks. This has been done to schools throughout the country, and it is certainly helping some teachers to know what they should be teaching week by week. That's a good thing. And there are definitely schools. We're not saying that all South African schools are terrible. There are schools, there are special principals and wonderful teachers working in very difficult circumstances around the country. But overall, we are not delivering, and that's why we're at the bottom of international tables. We did get some changes happening from about 2005 to 2015, and credit must be given for that. Partly people are saying because of the introduction of the ANAs, the annual assessments, and of NEDU's role, but then those were withdrawn. And since about 2015, 2016, the positive developments we were starting to see from a very low base have stopped. And then COVID hit us, which was devastating to South Africa and many other countries' education systems. And it's estimated that a 10-year-old child today, or learner today, is about a year behind where they should be. Now, the question I would ask is, what is the plan to deal with this? We're not seeing that. So it's not everything's terrible, but we need to be honest with ourselves that this is not a well-functioning system, and we have to introduce system-wide reforms in order to get the basics working properly so that we can move forward. We also need some public targets. So, for example, in 2019, the president said in a speech that we should teach all our learners should be able to read for meaning by 2030. But these were just words in a speech. As the recent reading panel report told us, there's no national reading plan, there's no budget, there's no indication of what progress is being made or how they're attempting to do this. In fact, they would argue that we've probably gone back a bit since 2019. So we're in favor of clear targets. We're suggesting other targets. For example, let's be like Peru. Vuyo, you will like this. They had a wonderful statement. The minister said, well, we can't beat Brazil at soccer, but we're going to beat them at maths. And so maybe South Africa should say, we are going to aim every 5 years to move up 12 places in the international tables. That's the target. Judge us on that target, and we're going to do everything we can to do that. And so otherwise, how do you move up? How do we assess the system, and how do we assess that we're getting value for money?
And Bernstein, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
The CDE releasing that report, those reports today to the public, which really paints an unflattering picture of our basic education system. Time to take a quick ad break before our panel of experts, including a leading official of the Department of Education, weighs in.